Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, I got a number of things I want to try and get to today, so let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows and the information coming. So, if you enjoy the information, the lectures, the shows, the discussions, the revelations, the guests and the hosts on the other shows of the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website, if you're not there listening online now, and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $15 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need the support of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, there you go. LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com. How about it? We need your support. Give us a hand. We're trying to set America free from the unconstitutional enforcement of the income tax as a direct tax on all labor and workings of the American people, which is absolutely unconstitutional, and which unconstitutional enforcement operations have been exposed by the Supreme Court in a decision last year where they specifically wrote income taxes are indirect taxes. They're not direct taxes at all. And they wrote all direct taxes must be apportioned to the several states for payment in proportion to the census. And that means there never was a non-apportioned direct tax for the government to enforce for the last 50 years in violation of the Constitution, which is what they have been doing. Every single circuit court has its own precedent that it points to say it's a non-apportioned direct tax and will fine you $25,000 for correctly arguing the Constitution, which is what they've been doing to American citizens who understood it. And the courts, of course, have betrayed the American people, thrown you under the bus to enforce not any constitutional taxation, but the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which calls for a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation. That's where you find used taxation to divide the population into classes and then keep the classes fighting in the streets amongst each other. And they'll never notice it's the political class looting the treasury and running it out. And as goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life of its people. The further in debt you get, we're at 37 trillion and counting, the less your currency is worth, until eventually, ultimately, if this is not addressed, it's printed into oblivion. Absolute worthlessness. And that is the history of every single paper currency in history. And ours is going the same way. So we need to put an end to this unconstitutional system that enslaves the American people in a peonage debt service system, not one of taxation, enslaves them to the endless servicing of the endlessly increasing debt owed to the private corporation and the Federal Reserve Bank, which isn't lending money to the federal government. They're just printing debt that your government, we the people ultimately, are responsible for the repayment of, with interest, for the rest of all time. And of course, as long as the debt keeps running up, the interest number you have to pay every year keeps running up. It's now the largest single budget expenditure, something like 1.3 trillion, which is higher than your defense and other spending. So the debt is beginning to have its effect, and if the American people don't get a handle on it, it's going to destroy our society and our currency. So last week when we cut off, I was talking about how the Supreme Court's decision has exposed the current system as a complete and total constitutional fraud. It's communistic, it's not constitutional, it's not an apportioned tax, which it would have to be if it were direct, and it's not a uniform tax because they've substituted geographical uniformity for intrinsic uniformity. And I explained last week they did that through a series of decisions in the late 1800s, 1860 through 1890, where they held that Congress has the power to discriminate against the inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to taxation, and to discriminate against the corporate person, the licensed person, and the foreign person, who are all privileged in being allowed to work and earn money in America. And it's the privilege that's the subject of the tax. Foreigners are taxed by impost rather than excise, which is the privilege that taxes commodities, licenses, and corporations. Now, at that time, it was outside the realm of possibility for the government to tax the American people directly. So when the court held that tax brackets were allowed on the basis of geographical uniformity, they were talking about the taxation of inanimate or unprivileged or persons without rights, the foreigners, the licensed person, the corporate person. Those were the only parties subject to tax, and it was held that Congress had the power to discriminate against those parties and articles subject to tax based on how much earnings were earned based on the privilege enjoyed. So a corporation earning 100 million or 10 million could be taxed at a higher rate than a corporation earning 10,000 or 100,000. And this is based on the power of Congress to discriminate. And it was deemed okay as long as it was geographically uniform, which means that each person and each bracket in every state has to be treated the same as the other people in that bracket in the other states. And this was held to be geographically uniform. Now, that application of geographical uniformity has been passed over through the 16th Amendment to be applied to the American people. But when you test this theory of geographical uniformity rather than intrinsic uniformity, you see that the theory of geographical uniformity does not hold water under the Constitution when applied to citizens. Why? Well, let's test the theory. The theory says it's okay to tax people who make more income or more earnings than people who don't. So Congress has the power to discriminate against citizens on the basis of earnings, they say. Well, let's test that. What would happen if Congress wrote a law to tax Jews at 95% and Christians at 5%? Would that be okay? Well, geographical uniformity says, yeah, that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. As long as all the Jews in Texas, New York, Florida, and Michigan and every other state are all treated the same. It's perfectly okay to tax Jews at 95% because Congress has the power to discriminate. Right? Right? No, wrong. Wrong. Geographical uniformity opens the door to Congress writing tax law to tax race or color or national origin or religion or age or gender. None of those things would be legitimate bases for taxation. Why? Because Congress doesn't have any authority to discriminate in any manner whatsoever against the American people. None. Not on age, not on gender, not on race, not on religion, not on national origin, not on income or revenue or property or wealth or earnings. None of those things can be the basis for discriminating against the American people who don't earn money by any taxable privilege, but by right outside of the federal authority to tax, and in the 50 states, it's outside of the territorial authority the federal government has to write law. So geographical uniformity is a complete and total fraud. And as I pointed out last week, A flat tax at 10% for everyone is also unconstitutional because that's direct taxation without a basis in impost, duty, or excise. So as long as you're trying to tax the labor, the fruits of labor, the property, the earnings, you're taxing rights, not taxable privilege. And geographical uniformity doesn't apply, and the tax doesn't apply. It's all been a fraud. The American people are not the constitutionally taxable person, the corporate person, the licensed person, the foreign person, the person handling or involved in manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities. Citizens aren't involved in those activities. And where there is no impost, duty, or excise tax imposed on the activity or transaction, there is no tax to measure by income. And there's no brackets that can be imposed on the American people. Only the privileged parties. That's kind of why they need you to assume the tax yourself and make yourself liable for whatever rate you assess on the 1040 when you voluntarily file it. When you shouldn't be filing a tax return at all. You should be claiming exempt on your W-4, and then you don't have to file to get a refund when you're young, and you never have to file because there's no requirement to give up your Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights and make a full disclosure. It's all a fraud. There is no direct tax on your income or your revenue. The Supreme Court specifically wrote 1 year ago, income taxes are indirect taxes, and all direct taxes must be apportioned to the several states for payments and cannot be enforced against an individual person, which is what they've been doing for 50 years. You made money, you owe tax. It's a direct tax on your person. It's unavoidable. Pay us. The whole thing is a constitutional fraud dreamed up by the lower circuit court judges who have decided to enforce their personal political philosophy, communism. Not constitutional taxation, but socialism in the form literally of communism. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto, together with the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto, which is the Federal Reserve Bank. The judges know they're not funding the government, they're funding the borrowing of money. They're enslaving you to make you pay the interest on the 37, 38, 39, 40 trillion that Congress has unconstitutionally run up with the unconstitutional monopoly on currency and credit that we've given to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation, which is no more federal than Federal Express or Federated Department Stores, and which has no reserves. They kited the first check. The bankers have never put a dime of their own money into the system. It's all a paper note debt system, not one of currency, money, or of honest taxation. So we have been thrown under the bus by the lower circuit court judges, and for the last 45 years, up until last year, by the Supreme Court, who has refused to intervene and address this seditious rebellion occurring in the circuits and the district court and the United States government. They've refused to address it. And this court has finally taken it up. And not only have they taken it up, but they also threw out the regulatory deference of Chevron. They threw out affirmative action. And they've now thrown out the direct tax under Moore et al. v. United States, which I've talked about extensively. Okay, I think I hear the first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I do urge you to find your way over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com website. Get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, and I'll be back in 5 with more. to come over here and go to Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's just get right back into it. And commercial a break came up, I was talking about how the income tax is going to fall. It's not the direct tax they've been enforcing it as. And it can't be imposed as an indirect tax on the activities of American citizens in the 50 states. Labor, private property, rent, interest, dividend, alimony, commissions, tips, salaries, wages. How are any of those things taxable by impost unless they're in a foreign possession or earned by a foreign person, by duty, which only taxes exported goods, or by excise, which taxes commodities, licenses, and privilege. Now, citizens don't earn their money from import, export in foreign places, commodities, licenses, or corporations. They earn by right. They're not subject to any impost, duty, or excise on their labor, and that's why the government has had to lie to you since World War II about it being the 16th Amendment that authorizes the tax as a direct tax, because it can't reach your labor or fruits of labor or paycheck or interest, rent, dividends, commissions, alimony, tips, etc. It can't reach those sources as an indirect tax, which have to be based not on a source of gross income, but an activity or transaction or event or in a place subject to an impost, a duty, or an excise. So there is no direct taxation. So the tax is going to fall, and it has to be replaced. And I said last week, it can't be replaced with a flat tax, because that's direct taxation, which the court has said has to be apportioned to the several states. And there's no way they could impose a flat tax of 15% on everyone and expect the states to pay it. The states could never extract that kind of revenue from their populations. The state agents would all be shot trying to do that. So it's impossible for them to tax income of the citizens directly or indirectly, unless it's derived from ATF, commodities, licenses, or as a corporation, or in a foreign place. Again, that's why they had to lie to you about it being a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. So you can't have a flat tax to replace the current unconstitutional, non-uniform direct tax. A flat tax would be a direct tax. It's unconstitutional too. So that's not a solution. You can't have a national sales tax or a VAT tax. A VAT tax is a federal tax at each level: wholesale, distributor, retail. So at each level of transfer of the good, there's an additional tax imposed. So it's a transactional tax, but it's occurring in the states. It would be, rather than, and what's going on here is the Interstate Commerce Clause has long been perceived as a bar to the taxation of retail sales by the federal government, who, under that authority, the Interstate Commerce Clause, is allowed to tax the first sale at the wholesale level after interstate transport. That's what happens with fuels. The tax is built in to the price at the pump because it's already been paid by the wholesaler who brought the fuel in across the state line and delivered it to the station for retail sale. So you can't have a national sales tax. It's prohibited by the Constitution, which preserves the sovereignty of the states to legislate and control their own affairs, which includes a sales tax in the state. The federal government can't jump in and impose a sales tax because it's the state's territory, and that would be interfering with the state's taxation of sales in their state and making it excessive. So there can't be a national sales tax or a VAT tax because it's taxing in the exclusive territorial and legislative domain of the states, who have control over sales taxes in the states. So you can't have a flat tax. You can't have a sales tax because that's unconstitutional invasion of the states. You can't have a VAT tax for the same reason. And there's another thing they've been talking about, a fair tax, which my understanding is that's a 25% tax, a sales tax, in place of Social Security, the income tax, and I don't know if unemployment's and Medicare's in there too, but they want to have a 25% federal sales tax. The fair tax. Yeah, right. The states have found that when a sales tax rises above 6%, their revenue goes down. It doesn't go up. People will accept a sales tax up to about 5-6% without objecting at the cash register. But when you get to 7-8-9% in sales tax, the state's revenues go down because people go into another state to consume, or they go under the table, or they slow up their own consumption to protest the tax, or because they can't afford the tax. It's an additional almost 10%. So the states have found that when a sales tax goes above 6%, it impacts above board sales and economic activity, and tax revenue actually goes down. So you tell me, how fast would it take a 25% national sales tax to completely destroy the entire economy? What do you think? 2 weeks? Or would it be one? So you can't have a sales tax, you can't have a fair tax, you can't have a flat tax, you can't have a VAT tax. What are you going to do? Well, why don't you do what the Constitution authorizes you to do? You don't have to tax just profits, which of course the corporations have avoided paying by false accounting. They simply artificially inflate expenses or pay their officers more, and lo and behold, at the end of the year, they don't have any profit to tax. So they're avoiding tax by false accounting, and they're making their business decisions based on tax law rather than good, sound business decisions. It demotivates companies to show a profit and encourages them to inflate expenses lobbying Congress so that the congressmen get rich instead of the shareholders of the company getting paid dividends. And then you end up with law that allows the corporations to cheat everybody. So when you tax profit, you motivate the companies to not have any profit, to use false accounting, and to evade and avoid the tax, and that's what most of them do legally, by inflating expenses which don't get challenged. So there's no tax collected from the corporations to speak of, none sufficient to run the government off of, and that compels the shifting of the entire tax system and its burden onto the backs of labor, which is where we are today. And enslaved people working not to provide taxes to the government for its operations, but to service the endless debt in a peonage debt service system where all the money allegedly collected and paid for tax actually goes to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation, and never goes to the Treasury. It's all a fraud. It's not tax, it's peonage debt service. And as long as the Federal Reserve Bank sees the American people allowing their labor to be collectively used to collateralize the never-ending debt, they will continue to lend more to the irresponsible and unconstitutional operations of Congress. So how do you fix it? Well, don't tax profit. You can tax by excise the privilege of the corporation. So tax the revenue, all of it. No deductions, no exceptions, no write-offs, no expenses. Everything you make. And don't tax it at 40%, of course. That's silly. You tax at 3.5% to 5%. Of every single penny made, no deductions, no expenses. If you want to write it off and not have profits, you do it and explain it to your shareholders without having tax law to blame for it. Go ahead. Explain to the shareholders why the CEO made $100 million and the shareholders didn't get a penny in dividend. Go ahead. Explain it to them when you don't have tax law to blame it on. Because the dividends aren't taxable to the American person. And the revenue is taxable to the corporation only going in. So should they give it to the shareholders or should they spend it on themselves in order to inflate expenses and not have any profit to pay tax on at the end of the year? So that the officers of the corporations live like the aristocracy ruling the country because they have unlimited access to the wealth to pay themselves as an expense to minimize the corporate tax. And the shareholders get screwed, and the public gets screwed, and the aristocracy gets wealthy. And the American people are enslaved to the debt that the government and the corporations have access to, which Main Street is denied. So what you need to do is tax all corporate revenues, no exceptions, at 3.5% to 5%. And the reason why I picked that number is because if you pick a company like ExxonMobil and analyze them, you'll see that they have reported for like the last 15 years, 110 billion in earnings every quarter. Doesn't go up, doesn't go down. They got it planned this way. So they make about $500 billion, 450 billion every year in earnings. Is that what they pay tax on? Hell no. But ExxonMobil is one of the few companies that's making money so fast, there's such a cash cow, they can't get rid of it all with expenses. They can only get rid of about 400 billion of it, 90%. So they pay tax on 45 billion at a 33% rate. They're taxing and paying about 15 billion on 450 billion in revenues. Now what's that rate? That's about 3.5%. So if you tax them at 5% or 3.5% to 5%, it wouldn't be any different for ExxonMobil. They'd still end up paying the same 45 to 50 billion that they're paying now. But what would happen when you tell ExxonMobil it doesn't matter how much you make, you won't have to pay any more in tax? Are they going to make $500 million next year, or will they make 3/4? And then 1, and then 1.5, and within 4 years they could be earning 2 billion if you turn them loose from tax constraints. So you need to tax all corporate revenues. And of course, ExxonMobil would then not be the only company paying. Every single company in America would be turning over 5% every month on a quarterly basis. And those revenues from every single company operation in America becomes the monthly budget Congress has to live within. That provides your revenues to operate the government. 5% of all corporate earnings across the board sent in quarterly, no deductions. The income tax ends. No corporate income tax, no personal income tax. The American people get to keep 100% of their paycheck so they can get caught up on the rent and utility bills, help their family, neighbors and friends if they want, or have a little extra cash to try and start a business on the side so that the family can keep up with inflation, which is undermining and eating away at the purchasing power of every dollar you earn. So we need to get rid of the income tax and tax corporate revenues. You immediately dissolve the Internal Revenue Service, because I don't think either the income tax nor the Internal Revenue Service can survive the coming revelation that the last 50 years of tax enforcement has been a constitutional fraud. Both the tax and the IRS have got to go. It shouldn't be an IRS. You should dissolve it and immediately reconstitute it as the CRS, the Corporate Revenue Service. No doubt now about who's being taxed. It's not internal revenue, it's corporate revenue. And only corporate revenue. Americans get to keep what they earn. They have a right to work. It's not a taxable privilege. There's no license. There's no commodity. There's no foreign import or export or no activity in a foreign place like the possessions, which is where the original income tax legislation of 1913 was imposed. Not in the 50 states, not on the American people, in the possessions. Okay, we'll be back in 5 with more. I hear the second commercial break coming up. If you want to read about all this, get over to taxfreedom.com. If you know anyone that needs help, send them to irszoom.com. We're there, and we can help you. Yo, what? Okay. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's get right back into it. When the commercial break came up, I was saying that we need to replace the current income tax system, both the personal and the corporate income tax, by repealing the taxation of income in its entirety, because the taxation of labor is unconstitutional and communistic, which is repugnant to the Constitution and not consistent or allowable under it. They're opposing philosophies, one of private property, one of government control of the means of production. They're antithetical to each other. So, we need a new system, and I propose that the way to do it is a 5% flat tax on all corporate earnings. Now, that will raise the revenue for the government to operation, but obviously it isn't going to fund the socialist welfare redistribution system we have in place. And to fix that, I propose that you start means testing your welfare benefit recipients, including Social Security and Medicare. These programs need to be means tested. If you have more than X dollars in gross net worth, you shouldn't be getting Social Security, at least not 100% of it. If you have over $1 million in net worth, why are you getting Social Security? And if you do, you're probably getting $3,000, $4,000 a month because you paid in a lot to get to that $1 million net worth, but now you're worth $1 million. Why are you getting Social Security? You shouldn't be getting any Social Security. If you're worth over $1 million, you should live off your own money until that possession is drained down to what some level Congress has to decide on. You go below 500,000 in net value and you start to get Social Security, 20%. You get 20% more for every 100,000 you go down. So when you get to less than $100,000 in gross net worth, you're getting 100% of your Social Security benefit. Some kind of graduated system that means test the recipients. You have to stop using up the bulk of the Social Security resources paying people that don't need the benefit. It was originally created in the late 30s under the premise of safety net, widows and orphans. Widows and orphans. You got to help those that slip through the cracks, not use it as an entitlement to buy the votes of the insecure wealthy because they're elderly and want the government money instead of spending their own because they know inflation will eat it away. So you need to means test your recipient programs. You need to tax corporate revenues. And the last piece is you have to make the federal government smaller and get back inside the constitutional box. And I've talked about the way to do that is to take all of these federal agencies that are not authorized to exist under the Constitution, agriculture, energy, housing, transportation, commerce. We don't need all of these exclusive agencies. They're usurping state authorities. We got agriculture, commerce, labor, health and human services, HUD, transportation, energy, education, EPA, OSHA. None of these agencies have constitutional foundation to their existence. These are all programs that were usurped by the federal government during times of a national emergency that the government engineered with bad policy, like the Department of Energy, which was created in 1977 as a result of the Carter oil crisis that they created with bad policy, with Iran. And of course, well, we won't get into it. But anyway, all of these federal agencies need to be abolished. How do you abolish them? Well, why don't we move them to the states so that each state can minister to their agricultural needs, labor, health and human services, housing, transportation, energy, education, environmental protection, and occupational safety. All of these things are state functions. Oh, but the states don't have the money to do it. Okay, well, let's get rid of the federal agencies. Let's cut the collective budget for all of these agencies we're eliminating. Let's cut it across the board by 10%. and then distribute that money proportionately to the states so that the state capitals can spend that money in the 50 states and stimulate business and economy relating to agriculture, commerce, labor, health and human services, housing, transportation, energy, education, environmental protection, occupational safety. Let's let the states have the money to do all that. They won't mind that the fund's been cut 10% across the board because they didn't get a dime last year. And then we're going to cut those funds 10% every single year going forward until the budget is balanced. And that's how you balance the budget. You limit the government to corporate revenue taxation, the pay for government operations. You means test your welfare program so that the rich don't drain the resources and the poor can be paid enough to actually survive from month to month, which they don't get enough now to do that. The wealthy get $3,000 a month, but the poor get $600, $700 a month. How are you going to live on $600, $700 a month if you're poor? Social Security is your only check. It's absolutely reversed. That wealthy person should be getting $600. The poor should be getting the $3,000, or at least the two. So the program's backwards. It's being used to buy votes from the wealthy. It's not being used as a safety net to help the poor. And the poor who think they're getting helped are just fooling themselves, because the program's set up to never pay the poor, who typically die off before they reach the age of eligibility to withdraw. It was specifically set up that way for the black population. You don't get to draw until you're dead, unless you're a black woman. They might get a few years on Social Security. So, you means test your recipients. You tax corporate revenues at 5%. You bundle up all the unconstitutional agencies, slash their budget across the board 10%, and distribute the funds to the states proportionate to the census so that every state can administer those funds for education, energy, agriculture, whatever things it thinks are most important to the state at the time. The states should spend that money from within the state. As it is, all the money's being spent out of Washington, D.C., which is just making the politicians rich and the lobbies around D.C. rich. Let's spread some of that money around and get it spent out of all 50 state capitals. Why should all this money for these programs be spent out of the federal government? They got no constitutional authority to be involved with any of it. They only are because of the regulatory deference of Chevron, which is gone now under the Supreme Court. Under Loper Bright, they killed off the doctrine under Chevron of regulatory deference, where the bureaucratic deep state can write its own laws in the form of regulations that go beyond the command of the statutes, to give the bureaucrats whatever authority they deem necessary to steal and usurp authority, to steal property and usurp authority in the field in the states, where they can tell the farmer his drainage ditch is a navigable waterway controlled by the EPA now. It's all constitutional fraud. Bundle up the agency dollars, cut them 10%, distribute them to the states, and slash them 10% every single year until the budget is balanced and stop running a deficit. That's what has to be done. The power needs to be shifted away from the central federal government, which is screwing everything up. Look at what they just did with energy policy under Biden's 4 years. Completely destroyed the American economy by running the price of energy up so high it cascaded into the price of every single product on every single shelf in every single store in every single county in the country because of the price of energy that went up. It's called inflation caused by Biden's energy. Now, if that money had been distributed to the states with intelligent energy policy wouldn't have been suffering the catastrophic increases in energy that the other states did. What am I talking about? Ask someone from California how the electric rates are there. Yeah, we're going to electrify the country. Sure, right. At a $1,500 a month electric bill. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. So, the last element, of course, is getting rid of this enforcement of the income tax based on gross income. Section 61, sources of gross income. That has been the argued basis for you owing tax, a direct tax. And how is the direct tax imposed? Oh, on all sources of gross income. Everything you earn is taxable because of Section 61. And this, of course, all goes back to 1955 in the Commissioner v. Glenshaw Glass decision, which, like Roe v. Wade, like Chevron, like the affirmative action decisions, has to be overturned by the Supreme Court because it's that 1955 Glenshaw Glass decision that the federal government points to as the reason why Section 61 can be used to tax everything you do, because the Supreme Court ruled in 1955 that Section 61 was Congress acting to tax all accessions to wealth. And of course, this was done right after Section 61 was recodified in 1954 from Section 22A to Section 61. So when the court looked at it in 1955, they didn't see a history beside Section 61. They just saw a tax imposed on all sources of income and declared it Congress taxing all accessions to wealth, conveniently losing track of the fact that Section 22A, the statute from which Section 61 was recodified to, Section 22A was enacted not in 1913 as part of the income tax laws, but 5 years later in 1918. And the original legislation that Section 61 was enacted as Section 22A, was a Canadian tax treaty, a 75-year-long Canadian tax treaty that taxed all sources of gross income earned in Canada under the treaty between 1918 and 1975. That's how Section 61 was applied, as a foreign tax under the Canadian tax treaty. This is still published in the law today, and it's all available at the information on taxfreedom.com. So Section 61 is a fraudulent basis for the application of the direct tax, and that's that Glenshaw Glass decision, like Chevron and the affirmative action and Roe v. Wade, that needs to be overturned and thrown away, because it's that Glenshaw Glass decision that the liberal court of the Roosevelt era used to communize and socialize the American people, to attach themselves to your paycheck, to begin the communistic direct graduated taxation of all revenue, from labor, from the right to work, from the fruits of labor, from your private property, none of which is taxable to the federal government by impost, duty, or excise. None of it. So the whole thing's a fraud. The direct taxation is a fraud. The non-apportioned direct taxation is a fraud. The claim that the 16th Amendment authorizes the tax is a fraud. The claim that Section 61 authorizes the taxation of all sources of earnings of the American people in the 50 states is a fraud. The whole entire system is a constitutional fraud. And until the American people wake up and start telling each other about it and teaching each other the information that's right here, you're going to be enslaved in a rapidly deteriorating economic environment, which is deteriorating for Main Street, even while it flourishes for Wall Street, through the printed dollars that only Wall Street has access to, while Main Street is denied capital by a Federal Reserve Bank interest rate that's way too high. So there's your problems and there's your solutions, all summed up in an hour. Spread the word, pass it around, make it go viral. Go read it at the Thomas Freed YouTube channel. We'll be back next week with more.